I want to tell you about the moment I realized I had been quietly falling apart for 20 years without knowing it. I was not sick. I was not in pain. I had not been diagnosed with anything. By every standard metric, blood pressure, resting heart rate, body weight, I was a healthy 39-year-old. I worked out 3 times a week. I watched what I ate. I slept 7 hours a night. I was doing everything the conventional health conversation told me to do. Then one afternoon, I sat down on my living room floor to look for something under the couch. And when I tried to stand back up, I had to grab the coffee table. I am 39 years old. I sat there for a moment after that, not embarrassed, just genuinely puzzled. There was no pain, no injury, no sudden failure of anything I could identify. My body had simply stopped being able to perform a movement that every healthy toddler on earth executes dozens of times a day without a second thought. And it had stopped without ever telling me, without a warning sign, without a threshold moment, without anything that would have prompted me to notice. That is when I started asking questions. And the answers I found over the following months changed how I think about aging, about the body, about the furniture in my house, and about what it actually means to take care of yourself. Because the story I had been told about how bodies age, the gradual, inevitable, largely genetic decline, is not the whole story. There is another story running underneath it, a quieter, more mechanical story about what happens when a 2 million-year-old biological structure spends its entire adult life inside a piece of furniture that has only existed for 5,000 years. That story begins with a number. In 2012, a Brazilian physician and researcher named Claudio Gil Araujo published findings from a study he had been running at Clinimex, his exercise medicine clinic in Rio de Janeiro. He had designed a test. The test required nothing, no equipment, no blood work, no physician, no clinical setting, just a floor and the willingness to be honest about what your body could do. 2,002 adults between the ages of 51 and 80 were asked to perform 2 movements in sequence. Sit down on the floor from standing, then stand back up. The only rule was that neither movement could use hands, knees, forearms, or any external support. Each direction was scored out of 5 points. Maximum composite score 10. Every time a hand came down, 1 point was deducted. Every knee that touched the floor, 1 point. Every wobble, half a point. The deductions were not arbitrary. Each one corresponded to a specific compensatory pattern the body was using to substitute for a physical capacity it no longer had. The cohort was followed for a median of 6.3 years. Participants who scored between 0 and 3 on the composite test had a 5 to 6 times higher all-cause mortality rate compared to those who scored 8 to 10. After controlling for age, sex, and body mass index, each single point improvement in the composite score was associated with a 21% reduction in mortality risk. 21% per point. On a 10-point scale. I read that sentence 4 times when I first encountered it. Then I put down what I was reading and sat on the floor and tried the test myself. I scored a 6. I needed one hand on the way down and my knee grazed the floor on the way up. 2 deductions, a 6 out of 10. Which according to the mortality data put me in a middle category for a 39-year-old, but trending in the wrong direction for what I would be at 50 or 60 or 70 if I continued accumulating chair time at the rate I had been. The question that would not leave me alone was the same one I kept returning to for months afterward. What is the floor testing that the clinic is not catching? Because this test was outperforming blood pressure as a mortality predictor. It was outperforming most standard clinical diagnostics, and it required nothing but gravity and a willingness to get down. The answer, I eventually understood, is that the floor is not testing one thing. It is testing the accumulated condition of an entire system that chair sitting degrades across decades. And the degradation is so gradual, so invisible, so quiet in its early stages that most people never notice it until it has already become their baseline. Let me explain what I mean by the chair being a problem, because this requires some specificity to land properly. A standard chair positions the hips at approximately 90 degrees of flexion, the knees at 90 degrees, the ankles near neutral, the spine at a fixed trunk-to-hip angle supported either by a backrest or by sustained muscular effort. This is one position, one fixed configuration of the musculoskeletal system held for the majority of waking hours, across the majority of days, across the majority of decades of an adult human life. The body is an adaptive structure. It is the most adaptive structure in all of biology. It does not maintain capacities it is not asked to use. It remodels itself continuously around the signals it receives from the environment. Bone density responds to mechanical loading. Muscle mass responds to force demand. Connective tissue remodels around the range it is regularly moved through. The motor cortex prunes neural pathways that go unused and reinforces those that are activated repeatedly. Give the body one position for 8 hours a day for 50 years, and it will build itself around that position. It will shed every capacity that position does not require. Not out of failure, out of efficiency, The body does not carry what it does not need. The problem is that the position the chair provides is the narrowest, least varied seated posture available to the human skeleton. I spent considerable time reading the research of biomechanist Katie Bowman, who has studied movement variability across human populations for 2 decades. Her documentation shows that floor sitting exposes the hip joint to approximately 30 distinct positional configurations through the course of normal daily life. Cross-legged sitting requires 90 to 120 degrees of hip flexion combined with external rotation and abduction. Kneeling requires maximal knee flexion at approximately 150 degrees. A deep squat requires combined deep hip and knee flexion with significant ankle dorsiflexion. Side sitting creates asymmetric hip rotation. Each transition between positions is itself a movement stimulus. Each position loads different joint surfaces, stretches different muscle groups, activates different stabilizing chains. A chair provides one configuration, 30 configurations versus one, accumulated across every seated hour of an adult life. The difference in mechanical input to the cartilage, the joint capsule, the ligaments, the muscles, and the tendons of the hip complex is not a matter of degree. It is categorical. Now I want to tell you about the muscle that caused most of my problems, because when I finally understood this, everything about my lower back, my hip tightness, my posture, my fatigue, all of it suddenly had a single coherent explanation: the iliopsoas. Most people have never heard of it, and almost everyone in a chair-dominant culture has one that is quietly causing structural damage. The iliopsoas is the primary hip flexor. It originates from the lumbar vertebrae and the iliac fossa and inserts on the lesser trochanter of the femur. In a seated position, it is held in a shortened state, not slightly shortened, substantially shortened, for hours, every day. The cellular response to sustained shortening over months and years is adaptation. Sarcomeres, the contractile units of muscle tissue, are removed in series. The muscle physically remodels itself to be shorter. The connective tissue matrix surrounding it tightens around the new, shorter configuration. The muscle does not know it is being harmed. It is doing exactly what biology designed it to do: adapt to the mechanical signal it receives most consistently. When that person stands up from the chair, the shortened iliopsoas does not simply extend back to its original length. It pulls. It pulls the lumbar spine forward into increased lordosis. It tilts the pelvis anteriorly. It changes the mechanical loading across every intervertebral disc in the lower back, creating greater compression posteriorly and greater tension anteriorly. The erector spinae muscles have to work harder just to keep the person upright against the constant anterior pull of a hip flexor that has decided the sitting position is its permanent home. The lower back pain that I had been living with for 3 years, which I had attributed to long work hours, to stress, to a slightly too soft mattress, to just getting older, a significant fraction of it had a single mechanical cause: a muscle the chair had shortened over years until the shortening became structural. The therapy I had occasionally sought out treated the pain. The chair recreated the cause 8 hours later. I want to be clear about something here because I think it is the most important thing I learned in all of this research. The damage the chair causes is not felt as damage while it is happening. I did not feel my hip flexors shortening. I did not notice my ankle dorsiflexion declining. I did not experience my glutes gradually losing their ability to activate through their full range. The adaptations happen below the threshold of perception. The body normalizes each incremental change. By the time the cumulative effect is large enough to produce a symptom, the tight back, the stiff hips, the inability to get off the floor without assistance, the underlying cause has been building for years. This is why the sitting rising test is such a remarkable diagnostic tool. It does not test any single capacity in isolation. It tests the composite result of every system that chair sitting degrades simultaneously. And it does it through a movement so natural that any healthy body should be able to perform it without thought. The scoring is worth understanding in detail because each deduction tells you exactly which system has failed. A hand placed on the floor during the descent means the hip extensors cannot control the lowering through full range. The gluteus maximus and the hamstrings are not producing sufficient eccentric force to manage the deceleration. A knee touching down means the quadriceps cannot generate enough eccentric control to manage the transition. A wobble or balance loss means the proprioceptive system, the continuous positional data being sent from the foot, ankle, knee, and hip to the cerebellum, is not integrating fast enough or accurately enough to maintain stability through the movement. Each deduction is a system reporting its degradation. The body does not announce which system has failed. It reveals the failure through the movement itself. And the movement the test measures is precisely the movement the chair eliminates from daily life. Here is what I kept returning to as I went deeper into this. The predictive power of the test is concentrated not in the sitting but in the rising. Getting up from the floor without support requires the gluteus maximus to activate through its full range. And that is a demand that chair sitting never makes. The gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the human body. Its peak force production occurs at deep hip flexion, angles below 90 degrees. The chair holds the hip at exactly 90 degrees and goes no deeper. Standing from a chair begins at 90 degrees. The gluteus maximus barely engages at that angle. It does most of its work in the range below it, the range the chair eliminates. The consequence of decades without deep-range gluteal activation has a clinical name: gluteal amnesia. The motor cortex is a resource allocation system. It reduces its excitatory signal to muscles that are not being asked to produce force at their peak range. The gluteus maximus atrophies selectively at the deep flexion fiber lengths. The primary engine for rising from the ground becomes neurologically quieter with every year spent in a chair. When the person eventually tries to rise from the floor during the sitting rising test or during an ordinary moment on the living room carpet, the gluteus maximus cannot do the job it was designed for. The body substitutes. A hand goes down, a knee comes forward. Momentum is recruited where strength has been lost. The compensatory pattern works in the short term, but it is a workaround. And it is a workaround built on a system that is continuing to degrade. I want to bring in the Blue Zone research here because it was what finally made all of this feel not just mechanically true, but historically significant. Dan Buettner spent years documenting populations for National Geographic that live measurably longer than the global average. He identified 5 distinct regions he called Blue Zones: Okinawa in Japan, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, Nicoya in Costa Rica, Loma Linda in California. 5 populations, 5 completely different geographies, 5 different diets, climates, genetic backgrounds, cultural practices, and healthcare systems. Researchers have spent decades trying to isolate the variables that explain their longevity. Plant-heavy diets, strong social integration, sense of purpose, moderate consistent physical activity, low chronic stress. But there is one shared variable that the longevity research has never adequately explained. None of these populations sit in chairs. In Okinawa, the oldest living population on Earth, people eat their meals sitting on tatami mats on the floor. In Sardinia, the second longest-lived population, people sit on low wooden stools and stone benches. In Icaria, elderly residents sit on the ground to tend their gardens and conduct their social lives. In Nicoya, centenarians spend their days on hammocks and low platforms. In Loma Linda, the Seventh-day Adventist community that outlives every surrounding population in California gathers in homes and shared spaces on floor cushions and low seating. These people did not join mobility programs. They did not attend physical therapy. They did not follow floor-sitting protocols designed by researchers. They simply lived in a physical environment that required them to get down and get back up dozens of times every day for their entire lives. Every transition from floor to standing loaded the gluteus maximus through its full range. Every hour spent cross-legged or kneeling or squatting cycled the hip joints through positional configurations that delivered nutrients to cartilage surfaces the chair would never reach. Every morning of rising from a low sleeping surface trained the strength, balance, and motor coordination that the sitting rising test measures, and that Araujo's mortality data identifies as the strongest predictor of survival. I am not arguing that floor sitting is why these populations live longer. The causal picture is genuinely complex, and the correlation does not isolate floor sitting from the dozens of other factors that characterize these communities. What I am saying is more specific, and I think more defensible. The mechanism by which floor sitting maintains musculoskeletal function is established in the biomechanical literature. The mortality association with the capacity it maintains is replicated across multiple studies. And every Blue Zone population shares this behavioral variable alongside all the others. Whether it is a primary cause, a contributing factor, or a marker for a broader physical lifestyle, the mechanistic pathway from floor to function to survival is real. The question of where it ranks in the causal hierarchy does not diminish its relevance to anyone sitting in a chair right now. And now I need to tell you the thing that stopped me completely when I first encountered it. Because it reframes everything. The sitting rising test does not just predict mortality. It prescribes the intervention. Think about what that means. Blood pressure predicts mortality. Measuring your blood pressure does not lower your blood pressure. Body mass index predicts mortality. Stepping on a scale does not reduce your BMI. The sitting rising test predicts mortality. And practicing the exact movement the test scores reduces the mortality risk the test is measuring. Araujo's own subsequent research documented that subjects who began regularly practicing floor-to-standing transitions showed measurable improvements in their composite scores over the following months. Each point of improvement was associated with a 21% reduction in all-cause mortality risk. The test is not a fixed measurement of biological age. It is a measurement of current capacity, and current capacity responds to training. The testing and the training are the same action. The measurement is the medicine. This is not a metaphor. The movement that the test scores is the movement that reverses the degradation the test is measuring. Floor transitions load the gluteus maximus through the range it has lost. They demand ankle dorsiflexion. They require proprioceptive integration under load. They train the balance and coordination that the cerebellar pathways need to maintain across a transitional posture. Every floor-to-standing transition is simultaneously a diagnostic and a treatment. I want to address the reversibility question directly because I know it is the one most people in their 30s and 40s are actually asking. Is this damage already done? Can it actually be undone? The answer, based on everything I read, is yes, with caveats about time and severity, but yes. Soft tissue remodeling is bidirectional. The iliopsoas shortened because it received a sustained shortening signal over years. It will lengthen when it receives a sustained lengthening signal over weeks and months. Sarcomeres are added back in series, the exact inverse of the process that shortened the muscle. The joint capsule loosens when moved through increased range. The collagen matrix of connective tissue remodels around the mechanical signals it receives, regardless of the direction those signals point. The motor cortex retains plasticity for fundamental movement patterns throughout life. The neural architecture for squatting, kneeling, and rising from the floor was not deleted by decades of chair use. It was deprioritized. The pathways became quieter, less reinforced, less automatically accessible. But they are still there. They respond to practice. The first weeks of floor sitting in a body adapted to chairs are genuinely uncomfortable. I want to be honest about that because I think overselling the ease of this transition is a disservice. The hip external rotators resist cross-legged sitting. The ankles protest dorsiflexion. The knees ache in deep flexion. I experienced all of this. It was not pleasant. But I learned to interpret the discomfort differently once I understood what it represented. The tissues were receiving a mechanical signal they had not received in years. The discomfort was the signal being processed, not the signal causing damage. It was the adaptation beginning, not the adaptation failing. The protocol I followed was not aggressive. I started with a cushion under my hips to reduce the flexion demand while I still removed the backrest support. I kept a chair nearby for the first few weeks when practicing floor-to-standing transitions. Using it as a fail-safe, I progressively relied on less. I spent 20 to 30 minutes per evening on the floor instead of on the couch. Not exercising, just existing in a different positional environment. After 6 weeks, the cushion height had dropped significantly. After 3 months, I sat down on the living room floor and stood back up without touching anything. No coffee table, no sideways lunge. Just the movement, the way a human body is designed to perform it. I retested my sitting-rising score. I scored an 8, 2 points in 3 months, which according to the mortality data represents a 42% reduction in all-cause mortality risk compared to where I started. I am not claiming that number applies cleanly to a 39-year-old. The study cohort was 51 to 80, but the directional logic holds. The capacity improved. The systems the test measures were trained by the exact movement the test scores. The biology responded to the signal. Here is what I want you to take from all of this. Not a program, not a protocol, not a set of exercises, a reframe. The chair is not neutral furniture. It is a specific biomechanical environment, and the body adapts to it the same way it adapts to everything else. Completely, efficiently, and without asking permission. The adaptation is invisible while it is happening. By the time it produces a symptom, the tight back, the stiff hips, the hand on the coffee table, the underlying change has been building for years. The floor is not an exercise. It is the positional environment the human musculoskeletal system was calibrated for across 2 million years of evolutionary history. Every toddler on Earth demonstrates this. They squat to pick things up. They sit cross-legged without effort. They rise from the floor without support. Not because toddlers are exceptionally fit, but because the soft tissues around their joints have not yet been adapted away from the range the skeleton was designed to use. The capacity is not gone. In most bodies it is suppressed, and it responds to the signal of the floor the same way it always has because the biology that responds to that signal has not changed. Only the environment has. You will sit in chairs for the rest of your life. That is not the point. The point is the hours between the chairs. Whether the hip joint receives any time in the positional range that keeps its cartilage alive, whether the gluteus maximus activates through the depth it was built to generate power in, whether the floor-to-standing transition happens at all today, even once, without a hand reaching for something solid. The longest-lived populations on Earth did not have a secret. They had an absence. The absence of a piece of furniture that the rest of the world had decided was a necessity. The floor is still there. The test that predicts whether you will be alive in 6 years is also the practice that changes the prediction. The only question that remains, and it is not a rhetorical one, it is a practical one with a specific answer that compounds every year you delay it, is how much longer you're going to wait before you get down on it. I want to go a little deeper on the cartilage question because most people have never been told how joint cartilage actually survives. And once you understand the mechanism, the chair problem becomes even harder to dismiss. Articular cartilage, the smooth, resilient tissue that covers the ends of bones inside every joint in the body, has no blood supply. None. Unlike muscle, unlike bone, unlike virtually every other tissue in the body, cartilage cannot receive nutrients directly from the bloodstream because no blood vessels penetrate it. It receives its oxygen, glucose, and molecular building blocks through a process called imbibition, diffusion driven by mechanical loading and unloading of the joint. Here is how the mechanism works. When a joint is compressed, fluid is squeezed out of the cartilage matrix, the way water is pressed from a sponge. When the compression is released, fluid is drawn back in, carrying the nutrients the cartilage needs to maintain its structure and the metabolic activity of the chondrocytes, the cells responsible for building and maintaining the cartilage matrix. The cycle requires variation. Compression must alternate with release. Loading must shift from one surface to another. A joint that is held in continuous compression in a single position does not cycle fluid. It squeezes it out and keeps it out. A joint that is unloaded continuously receives no imbibition at all. Cartilage needs intermittent, varied, cyclical loading to stay alive, not exercise in the conventional sense. Movement through range. Now consider what the chair does to the hip joint over decades. A hip joint sitting at 90 degrees for 8 to 12 hours a day is loading the superior weight-bearing surface of the acetabulum and the femoral head continuously. That surface is compressed without adequate unloading cycles. The fluid is squeezed out and not drawn back in at the rate the chondrocytes need. Meanwhile, the posterior, anterior, and inferior surfaces of the joint, the surfaces that floor-sitting positions would load, receive minimal compression at all. No loading means no imbibition. No imbibition means no nutrition. The cartilage on the neglected surfaces is being starved. The osteoarthritis that develops in hip joints over time is typically described to patients as wear and tear. The phrase implies that movement causes the damage, that the joint is being used up like a machine component grinding itself down. This framing is not accurate. The damage comes not from too much loading, but from the wrong pattern of loading. Cartilage loaded cyclically through varied positions maintains its matrix. Cartilage loaded statically in one position, or not loaded at all, degrades through nutrient deprivation. The hip replacement surgery that a 70-year-old receives is replacing a joint surface that was starved, not worn. The distinction matters because one of those causes is modifiable and the other is not. Floor sitting distributes compressive loading across the entire articular surface of the hip. Cross-legged sitting loads the posterior inferior surface of the femoral head. Kneeling loads the posterior surface under full flexion. Deep squatting loads the anterior superior surface under combined flexion and compression. Each position delivers nutrients to a different region of cartilage. Each transition between positions is a pump cycle, pushing fluid into one region while drawing it into another. The joint is fed by movement through range. The chair restricts that feeding to a single surface for the majority of the joint's waking hours. I found this to be among the most practically significant things I learned, because it reframes the conventional advice about joint health almost completely. The standard guidance for people with hip pain or early osteoarthritis is often to rest the joint, to avoid positions that cause discomfort, to reduce loading. The biomechanical reality suggests that for many people, the problem is not too much movement, but too little variety of movement. The solution is not less loading, but different loading, cycling the joint through the range that delivers nutrition to the surfaces that have been starved. There is one more piece of this that I think deserves its own attention, and it is the piece that connects the physical degradation to something broader about how we age cognitively as well as physically. Every floor-to-standing transition is a proprioceptive challenge. Proprioception is the continuous stream of positional and movement information that the joints, muscles, tendons, and skin send to the brain, allowing it to know where the body is in space without looking. It is the system that lets you walk in the dark without falling. It is the system that catches you when you stumble. It is the system that coordinates the thousands of micro-adjustments the body makes every second to maintain balance and posture. Proprioception degrades with age. That is well established. But the rate at which it degrades is not fixed. It is a use-dependent capacity. Proprioceptive pathways are reinforced by movement that challenges them. Unstable surfaces, transitions between positions, balance demands under load. They are weakened by the absence of such challenges. Chair sitting is proprioceptively inert. The chair provides a stable, rigid external support for the body. The body does not have to work to stay upright because the chair is doing that work. The proprioceptive system is not challenged. The cerebellar pathways that integrate balance information are not stimulated. Over years and decades of chair dependence, the system that prevents falls becomes less sensitive, less accurate, less fast. The sitting rising test scores proprioception directly. The wobble deduction, the half-point loss for a loss of balance during the transition, is not a minor detail. It is the proprioceptive system declaring its current state, a state that responds to training the same way strength and flexibility do. I have been on the floor every evening for 8 months now, not performing exercises, not following a structured protocol, just choosing the floor over the couch for an hour or two while I read or talk. The discomfort that characterized the first weeks is largely gone. My sitting rising score is a 9. I am telling you this because the timeline matters. 8 months, not years of dedicated rehabilitation. 8 months of changing where I sit in the evenings. The tissues responded faster than I expected because they were never biologically incapable of the range. They had just been given no reason to maintain it. The body you have at 40 or 50 is not the body you are stuck with. It is the body that has adapted to the environment you provided. Provided a different environment and it will adapt to that one instead. The direction of the adaptation is not in question. The biology is intact. It is waiting for the signal. The chair removed the signal. The floor restores it. That is what the mortality data measures, what the biomechanics explains, and what the blue zone populations have been demonstrating without knowing it for generations. Not that they are genetically blessed, just that they never stopped giving their bodies the mechanical input those bodies were built to receive. The floor has always been there. The question has never been whether it works. The question is only whether you will use it.